Greetings everyone, I am Dr. J and welcome to Through the Looking Glass, where I look at old games I haven't played before to see if they hold up. For all the time I've spent with first-person shooters, it's about time I branched out with one of the most well-regarded console shooters of its time, Halo Combat Evolved. It is incredibly difficult to understate the impact that Halo had on the console market. At the time, first-person shooters had been attempted on the platform, but had largely been unsuccessful due to control issues, technical limitations, and so on and so forth. Halo, however, was the exception to the rule, which paved the way for shooters to become more prevalent on the market by presenting a test case that said, yes, you can make a first-person shooter work on consoles, here's how you do it. And the end result was a game that was remembered in large part for the multiplayer community it fostered, and a surprisingly good single-player campaign on top of that. For me personally, my interest was largely academic, as while I wouldn't be able to do well enough in a multiplayer setting to properly judge it, I've also heard a decent amount about the single-player campaign and wanted to see what all the fuss was about. Thus, after having completed it, does it hold up to scrutiny compared to the FPS of our day? Let's find out. Since the story is usually the least important aspect, let's start there. If I were to describe this world based purely on what the game gave us, there isn't much to go off of. We know this is our galaxy at some point in the future, we know that humanity is fighting this alien group known as the Covenant, and the group we're currently following is one that's on the run from one of those Covenant battle groups and is busy trying to stay alive while also investigating the place that they've crash landed onto. So when push comes to shove, there really isn't a lot to work with in that regard, but at the same time you don't really need much more than that, and the fact that there's so much I don't know actually kind of added to the game. It felt very much like a smaller conflict in a grand narrative. A narrative that we might not have all of the pieces for yet, but with enough pieces in play already to let us speculate and give a sense of grandeur to it. And especially with what happens in the story, it's a great jumping off point for newcomers to the series, as it gets you thinking about what's going on beyond this little part of the galaxy, but still remains focused enough to be engaging. When it comes to the story's execution, it comes back to something I've repeated in a lot of my reviews, namely the fact that it doesn't matter if something's generic so long as it's well done. If you really look at the story, it's fairly simplistic on the surface, as you've got the good guy humans fleeing from the bad guy aliens and all of the fun that entails, but despite that simplicity, it's surprisingly charming. There's a lot of personality given to each character, both in the cutscenes and while you're in combat. Your fellow soldiers will give commentary on what's going on, adding a surprising amount of levity compared to the circumstances around you, and the different Covenant soldiers also behave radically different from each other, to where it's almost amusing to go against them. Mostly because it's fun to watch them panic when you surprise them with a grenade or two. Grenade! When it comes to the main characters, you have the de facto leader Captain Keyes, who doesn't do too much within the context of the story, but is a focal point for the other characters to work off of. He plays the role of your typical stern officer, but underneath that, you can definitely tell he has a great deal of respect for the people who are working for and with him. Not much more to say about him beyond that, as he was really nice to have around, but didn't leave much of an impact on his own. If you really want impact though, you have the iconic Master Chief, who doesn't speak too much outside of cutscenes, but acts as an imposing force of will that can drive the player and story forward. They don't do a lot with him, as they try to make him a silent protagonist when you're in the driver's seat, but it's enough to where you get a sense that you don't mess with this guy, a message which you get to reinforce as you're playing the game. And then there's Cortana, a character who I knew absolutely nothing about going into this, besides the usual complaining about her character design by people who also haven't played the game, and are annoyed that an AI with a female voice also has a holographic projection of herself that is noticeably female. Granted, it's not as pronounced in this case, but it really bothers me when this conversation comes up, because it always seems to reduce interesting characters down to surface traits that end up not playing a huge role anyway. In the case of Cortana, I really liked having her around because she's such a contrast compared to Captain Keyes and Master Chief. Not because of her looks, but because of her mouth.
You alright?
Never been better. You can't imagine the wealth of information. The knowledge, so much, so fast. It's glorious.
So, what sort of weapon is it?
What are you talking about?
Let's stay focused. Halo, how do we use it against the Covenant?
This ring isn't a cudgel, you barbarian. It's something else.
This character has a witty or biting remark for pretty much everything you can think of, which meant whenever she was directing the conversation, it was always worth listening to. The amount of sarcasm that ended up coming from her is enough to give GLaDOS pause, to a degree where it's almost immersion breaking. In fact, the only reason that I would say it isn't immersion breaking is because when it happens, it's usually to give a degree of levity or sense of urgency to whatever's going on. And it also means that when she gets serious, you know that something big is about to happen and you better brace for impact. And speaking of which, it ends up starting off one of the key moments that people think of when they look back on this game's story mode. I won't talk about it directly, as I prefer to avoid spoilers whenever possible, but let me put it this way. I knew part of what was going to happen, but was still very impressed with how they handled it, and by not knowing about a couple of key details later on, there was still more than enough room to catch me by surprise and really blow me away. To explain why it works without going into specifics, let's talk about the graphics and overall presentation. The cinematography for cutscenes is really solid, and lends a lot to the reveal as they build up to it and when it actually happens. The graphics don't do the cutscenes justice, as the game engine was designed with combat instead of generic movement, but they do well enough to where it's not overly distracting. The only part that really bothers me is the audio balance, as while it's usually good during combat, there were multiple points in cutscenes where a character seemed unnaturally louder than they should be. Outside of that, I have very few complaints with respect to the audio, especially when you have music as iconic as that opening choir. Granted, the rest of the music is mostly just serviceable and is seemingly absent for large chunks of the game, but when it wants to be heard and set the proper tone, it is absolutely heard and always a welcome addition. So from this, you have a game that's able to present itself fairly well, albeit with some technical hiccups, so let's see if the game is worth playing through to get to that point. Before I get too far into it though, I should address the elephant in the room. Anyone familiar with Halo will know that what I've shown so far looks like Halo and quacks like Halo, but something might seem a little off nonetheless. Although given what I just said about the audio balance, I should probably see if I can tamper with that real quick. Hey, what's with the overblown sound effect? Surely you know what a cursor looks like, so why all the dramatics around that? It's about time I branched out with one of the most well-regarded console shooters of its time. It is incredibly difficult to understate the impact that Halo had on the console market. You can make a first-person shooter work on consoles, here's how you do it. Okay, fine, you got me. I did spend all this time talking about how this was revolutionary for consoles, and then I went and played the PC version. Fair cop, you got me. I'm a PC player through and through who grew up on the platform and couldn't aim with a controller to save his life. And if you need an example of that, here's my attempt at it. Yeah, I'd rather not emulate a game journalist while trying to be taken seriously, which meant I stuck to my comfortable keyboard and mouse setup. And with respect to the control scheme, I'm really torn as to what to say about it. On one hand, the game is definitely balanced around a controller, and you need look no further than the human pistol and assault rifle. You would expect the assault rifle to be the better weapon, as it's able to pour out bullets at a much faster rate and would therefore do a decent amount more damage. You would further expect this given that the box art in pretty much every cutscene features Master Chief using the assault rifle rather than whatever weapon we have equipped at that time. And if I were playing this on a console, it probably would be my favorite weapon because I could more easily spray and pray with it. However, because I'm playing this on a keyboard and mouse, I'm able to aim much more quickly and with greater accuracy, even if my relative skill level between controller and keyboard were the same. Instead of relying on the analog stick to eventually move to where I want to shoot, all I have to do is flick my wrist, push a single button, and suddenly the enemy collapses. And because of that greater accuracy, I ironically found myself using the pistol more, as while it wasn't as useful against the more beefier opponents, I could more reliably hit them and do so at a safer distance. This greater accuracy also meant that grenades were even more powerful than they already are, as it's a lot easier to set up a throwing arc than it would be if I had to aim away briefly and then make the throw and then go back to suppressing fire. As a result of that, part of me is concerned that I really did fail to play it the right way, as it were. Regardless of whether the game was originally intended for PC or not, the end product was designed with the controller in mind, and playing it with keyboard and mouse meant that the game balance was thrown somewhat out of whack. And yet, another part of me says that it's not my responsibility to play by the developer's rules. I know the phrase "the customer is always right" is greatly overused nowadays, but if you're going to make a PC version, then the onus should be on the developer to ensure that it works more effectively for it. Between making the AI more unpredictable or nerfing accuracy-based weapons, there were options they could have tinkered with that would have made sense in context, especially given that the overlap between console and PC players would likely be non-existent anyway. Regardless, the fact that I was able to use the pistol as an effective sniper rifle meant I could engage at a relatively comfortable distance, and meant I wasn't as prepared when the harder difficulty I chose started to make things more challenging. And yet, despite that elephant in the room, I'd be lying if I said it killed the mood, because in terms of gunplay, it is still really fun. The weapon variety is a little limited, especially early on, but it's handled well in tandem with the rest of the game. Since you don't have infinite ammo and can only carry 2 weapons, you're constantly encouraged to try out both the guns your fellow soldiers drop, as well as the Covenant weapons you can shamelessly loot from their corpses. That meant, even though I had my favorites, I was still able to try out and enjoy pretty much every weapon on offer, to where I was even forced to find a use for the standard assault rifle. When I was up against a large group of Covenant, it was a really potent weapon when I could guarantee most of my shots would find their mark, and though its functionality overlapped with the shotgun a little bit, it operated at a nice middle ground, where the opponent's shields were a little tougher and I didn't want to be standing as close as it's required to use the shotgun effectively. Besides, that shotgun got more than enough usage out of me anyway, because at the point where it's introduced, it's able to absolutely tear through the enemies you come across, and there's such a sense of impact from blowing enemies away with it that it ended up being my favorite weapon. Oh yes! That's the stuff. When it comes to the Covenant weapons, they start out as seeming mirrors of the human weapons, but have a few key differences. The human weapons, barring the rocket launcher, are hit-scan weapons that don't have to worry about travel time, while the Covenant weapons harken back to classic FPS and all of the projectile dodging shenanigans therein. The Covenant rifle is really good for pouring damage out at a decent rate, as the spread isn't too nasty and the travel time is usually enough to hamstring its effective range and keep it relatively balanced. The Covenant pistol carves out a place for itself through a charged shot which has a small homing component to it, which is a useful tool if you're peeking out from behind a rock and want to introduce someone to the life of a burn victim. And then you have the Needler, which is a purely homing weapon that can be avoided if you can duck behind terrain or step to the side before it can lock onto you, but has a small delay between when it finds its mark and actually deals damage. It's a really powerful weapon if you can set it up right, but also one that's effectively balanced by its projectile slow-moving nature. So with all of this talk about the weapons, you might think everything is sunshine and rainbows with respect to the combat, right? Well, the problem is that, as I'm thinking about it, I'm realizing more and more that the weapons were balanced for multiplayer. Barring the sniper rifle and rocket launcher, a lot of the weapons are meant to operate at a close to medium range, or effectively a closed-off arena where you're likely to run into opposing players and have to outsmart them rather than outgun them. However, for the games I review, I tend to avoid multiplayer discussions because, even if I were to find a multiplayer community, the likelihood of me standing a chance against them is slim to none. I'll probably already have plenty of comments telling me how bad I am with the single-player footage shown here, and I don't need to make it worse by competing against people who are actually competent. As such, the main thing which I'm judging, namely the single player, was seemingly balanced and designed after the multiplayer. And because of that, it definitely doesn't feel as tight from a mechanical perspective. Sure, it worked well enough in some regard, but there were multiple points where I ended up stuck. Not because I was doing any one thing particularly wrong, but because I was trying to play in a circumstance where it was basically one versus many, and their weapons hurt me just as much as mine hurt them. As a result, there were multiple points where the pacing slowed down to a crawl, as it became a patience game of figuring out the opponent's movements, figuring out what weapons they had versus what I had, and then hoping that I didn't miss someone armed with a rocket launcher who, despite my best efforts, could easily one-shot me. And honestly, I suspect that if you took out the moments where I got stuck on a particular encounter, you could probably shave 2 to 4 hours off of my game time, as it stopped being a matter of careful strategy and more a matter of throwing what I could against the wall and hoping it stuck. To be fair, however, there are a couple of related reasons for why that might be the case. For one thing, I was playing on heroic difficulty, which is the second to highest, instead of the default, which meant the enemies were generally tougher, could hit a lot harder, and were able to punish me for being careless. When I played with a controller, I knocked the difficulty down a peg, and if I were to finish playing through it that way, I probably would have had similar complaints, though I may have put more emphasis on normal difficulty's brain-dead AI instead. Granted, I didn't need to tone the difficulty down to beat the game, so I guess when push comes to shove it wasn't the worst thing in the world, but there you go regardless. For another, there is a bit of a disconnect whenever vehicles enter the equation. As mentioned earlier, the weapons feel like they're designed for close quarters or mid-range combat, which means when vehicles are introduced, it completely shifts the pacing and balance in a very different direction. Now, before I complain too much though, I do like the variety they have for the vehicles, as they all have their own little niche and are generally fun to use. However, in order for them to shine, you have to create a much wider battlefield, a circumstance which the infantry weapons don't really seem balanced around, outside of the sniper rifle for picking off pilots and the rocket launcher to counteract those vehicles. In fact, the main times that I did get stuck were often because I was in one of those open areas and didn't necessarily have the weapons or vehicles to properly handle the circumstance. And to further exacerbate the problem, you had the incredibly basic level design, which is so repetitive that you start to lose track of just how long you've been spending in a given section. If I were to give you a random part of the game, there are certainly unique rooms that signify a given section, but when it comes to the in-between areas, every open field looks like every other open field. Every corridor looked like every other corridor, with the only differences being subtle changes in arrangement here and there and the number and type of enemies you're up against. Honestly, all they had to do was change things up ever so slightly with the level design, be it add a new room type or make them more visually distinguishable, and I suspect that most of my pacing concerns would evaporate. And yet, for all my complaining, part of me can't help but wonder how much of it is legitimate. When it comes to gun balance, especially in open fields, that probably bears out, though it could be waved off by console players as the PC gamer not willing to play ball. However, when it comes to repetitiveness, one doesn't really have a leg to stand on when I still found myself losing track of time and wanting to continuously press on. In the back of my mind, when I was playing it, there was the inkling that I should probably stop, that this is probably too repetitive and that there were more than a few cases where the game balance could have been tighter. But that didn't stop me from playing for protracted lengths of time, even compared to other first-person shooters I've played recently. You just get into a zone where you're enjoying your time and there's a sense that time is flying by, but you don't really notice it until you look down at your watch and really see how late it's gotten. And I think the reason for that is because the game is really well done in every other way that matters. As I've demonstrated with the weapon variety and the shotgun especially, the gunplay is incredibly satisfying. All of the weapons have a unique sound and feeling of impact, and given how often I had to trade them out, it didn't matter as much that the level and enemy variety weren't all that well fleshed out because they didn't really need to be. The AI was competent enough to pose a threat given my issues with the game balance, but there were also enough useless grunts to where I could still get that sense of power from tearing through their ranks. There's so much personality put into those grunts on both sides and all sorts of chicanery involved with them that, even as I complain about repetitiveness, I found myself really enjoying my time with the game. And when push comes to shove, I think that's where my opinion really lies. If I wanted to rate this game over the coals for its audio balance issues during cutscenes, its questionable balance for keyboard and mouse, and the fact that it's far more repetitive and simplistic than we might find today, it wouldn't be difficult. And yet doing so would do the game a disservice, as while I won't ever know what it was like to play this game at release, to revel in the multiplayer mode and really get good at it, I can at least see the reason why it was successful. The guns all have their own little niche, the story has enough surprises to throw to where you want to know what will happen next, and though I can't repeat the word repetitive enough for the sake of this review, the core gameplay loop is so satisfying that it hardly ever mattered to me when I was actually playing it. So when push comes to shove, I can't say whether every newcomer to the franchise will like it, but I can say that this newcomer certainly did, and I'm looking forward to exploring this series further. Assuming I can bring my keyboard and mouse with me, otherwise the next one's gonna be a bit of a shift. Oh boy. With that said, that's all I have for this video. Thank you all for watching. Please like and share this if you find it deserving, and subscribe to this channel for the next game in Through the Looking Glass, as well as other content posted on a not-so-regular basis. And because of that irregular timing, please consider hitting notifications so that you know the moment a new video is uploaded, assuming that YouTube's system actually works as intended. For now, I'd better make sure I get back to work on the next game I have in mind. A lot of the games I'm looking at right now are a lot more long-winded than this game was, so it's gonna take me a bit to power through them and really get a handle for how good they are. Either way, thank you once again for watching, and I'll see you all later.